In our previous screencast, we were talking about art in the Spanish Netherlands, or what we often call Flanders, the southern part of the Netherlands, the Low Countries. That you remember during that lecture, we had talked about the fact that during the Baroque period, this region was at war with the northern part of the territory, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, which is Holland. This was a religiously based war. The Spanish Netherlands was Catholic. The United Provinces were Protestant. And we refer to it now as the 80 Years' War because it literally lasted 80 years. Began in 1568 when the King of Spain sent in troops to stop an iconoclastic riot, and did not end until 1648, with some breaks in the ongoing warfare. But it's worthwhile remembering that these two parts of the Low Countries were enemies, at least politically, during the early part of the 17th century, during the first half. Here we see an image of Dutch and Spanish warships fighting from exactly during this period by Cornelis Verbeek. And this lecture will talk about Baroque Holland, 17th century Holland, art that comes from these Protestant countries outside of Flanders. And there'll be some things that we see that are quite different here. In particular, because they're Protestant, there are no images of saints. We might have religious images, but they're primarily narrative scenes from the life of Christ or the Old Testament. But individual images of saints are much, much more rare. Now, this particular war decimated the finances of Spain. Spain went from being the leading economic power in all of Europe in the 16th century to being incredibly poor by the end of the 80 Years' War. And at the same time that this happened, what's fascinating is that in Holland, it led to the total dominance of the Dutch of seafaring trade. They became the masters of the high sea. And so here we see another picture of Dutch sea power, a painting by Albert Cuyp that shows a display of power, the amassed assembly of all of the Dutch fleet in the city of Dordrecht, one of the oldest cities in Holland, right around the time of the end of the war, sort of showing off their muscle just before the Peace of Westphalia that brought about the end of the 80 Years' War. This period, when Holland becomes the master of the high seas, Spain diminishes in power, is an era of incredible prosperity for Holland, a period of expansion of trade. This is the period of the Dutch East India Corporation. This is the period when the Dutch established the colony of New Amsterdam, which is now, of course, New York. And all of this prosperity meant that there was a very, very large market to buy art. Quite a few people could afford it because quite a few people were quite well to do. And in the 17th century, we find a new model for art production. Pictures being sold on the open market rather than by commission. Almost exclusively, not entirely, but the majority of them sold on spec, produced by artists to be sold out of their shops. And for this reason, many artists actually specialized in particular kinds of art in order to corner a part of that market. And sometimes we even have multiple variations of exactly the same composition, which leads us to understand how artists were making different versions of a popular composition to be distributed more widely. One of the artists who was a specialist that we'll talk about is Frans Hals. He was in the city of Haarlem, after which the neighborhood in New York is named, although they dropped the Dutch double A in the New York spelling. In the city of Haarlem, which is really just outside of Amsterdam, part of the broader metropolitan region. The northern Low Countries, the United Provinces, were one of the most heavily populated areas of all of Europe at this time, and even to this day they remain one of the most densely populated parts of all of Europe. And with this dense population, we have a number of centers of art production, not just Amsterdam, which was the most prosperous city, and the largest city, but a number of smaller cities as well were hotbeds of artistic activity. And Hals is in one of them in Harlem. And in his work, he did almost exclusively portraits, not entirely, but almost exclusively portraits. And all of his figures focus on the human actors in close up. And one of his great strengths in all of his pictures is the sense of characterization, the liveliness he's able to bring to the people who sit for him or any of the scenes that he does. Her face, for example, we don't know who she is. It tells us how old she is and when it was painted, but it doesn't give us her name. But you can see she's full of wit and vitality. She looks like a hoot. She looks like the aunt at your family reunion that you would want to hang out with because she's got really good stories and is probably going to dish pretty hard on the people she doesn't like. And she's got smile lines around her face, everywhere you look. This is not a woman who frowns. This is a woman who jokes and laughs. And you'll notice as we look at the picture that Frans Hals depicts her in this chair, turning toward us, and obviously very, very pleased to see us. And if you look at her hand, you'll notice that she grips the side of the chair because she's about to stand up to say hi to you. And all of this adds to the sense of spontaneity that the work has. It just seems so vibrant and so full of life. And you can also see, if we look at this detail, also go back and look at her face. Frans Hals paints in a way that looks as if it's spontaneous, as if he didn't spend a lot of time on it, as if it were sketchy still. And this is certainly an illusion. He spent quite a bit of time on these pictures, but what it adds to is this sense of vivacity, this sense of liveliness that makes the sitter seem really almost alive. In her other hand, she holds a small personal Bible for reading. And again, we can see the sketchiness of Frans Hals' brushwork, these little flecks and lines that we see on her hand, on her thumb. She is a member of the most dominant church. We presume she's a member of the most dominant church in the Low Countries, which were the Remonstrant strain of Calvinism, the followers of John Calvin. And this is important for us in understanding Dutch art because the Calvinist theology is built around restraint, is built around the idea of not showing off, not eating too much, not drinking too much, showing restraint in your personal life. And for this reason, Dutch people in public wore very, very simple black clothes to show their restraint. They're not very flashy at all. We might find some flashy military uniforms, but on the norm, we see people dressed in very simple black clothing. That said, within these social boundaries, there was some room for conspicuous display. For example, the lace pattern that we see on her sleeves around her headdress. These allow for a certain flamboyance, although within that restraint. We can also see, if we look more closely at her costume, how well embroidered that is as well. Covered with little designs, but it's black on black. And Hals is really good at painting black. Hundreds of shades of black, which is really incredibly difficult for artists, right? And of course, then there's that amazing rough collar, that exquisite collar that Hals paints with great detail. These are the areas where Dutch costume allowed for a certain flamboyance, but on the norm, Dutch costume, Dutch clothing was very, very restrained. What we see with his portrait is Hals's own strength, his own specialty, characterization, liveliness. These are what he does best. He also does paintings of everyday life, not portraits per se, although they kind of seem like portraits, but rather just scenes of people who hanging out in bars, having a drink. The jolly drinker or the jolly toper seems to be turning to us to offer us a drink that we might join him. He's ruddy-cheeked. He's already deep into his cups. Like our elderly woman, his lips are parted, and he acknowledges us. He's happy to see us. There's a really wonderful spirit in a lot of Dutch art, very down to earth and very humane spirit. But our Jolly Toper is probably just a scene of everyday life, probably not a portrait per se, and certainly adds to this appeal that so much Baroque art has, an appeal to our senses, an invitation to participate. Sometimes it's a little hard to tell whether they're portraits or genre scenes. This smaller picture of the National Gallery of a young man in a large hat could be a genre scene like The Jolly Drinker, or it could be a portrait as well. You'll notice he's leaning kind of around the back of the chair. He seems to come out through that porthole. And again, happy and engaged and absolutely delighted to see us in the same way that it's absolutely delightful to look at. This is, I think, our first woman artist, Judith Leister. She was working in Haarlem at the exact same time as Frans Hals, and may well have studied under him at one point in her career. Her handling of paint has that same loose and sketchy quality that we see in Frans Hals' work, and her approach to the subject matter is the same sort of vibrant, happy feeling. She too, like Frans Hals, does both portraits and scenes of revelers, like our drinker, like our young man in a large hat. Here's a self-portrait of her, and you can see that she's laughing as she paints. She has her mouth open. We can see the top row of her teeth beneath her lip. She leans on the chair to stop her work because she's happy to see you as you've come to visit her. What's interesting as she paints is that she's dressed wholly inappropriate for the activity. She's wearing very, very refined clothing, that beautiful purple sleeve, the red dress down below the skirt that we can see. But look at that collar, that amazing lace collar that adorns her simple black outfit. Certainly not the sort of thing that you would wear while painting in oil paint, where the paints don't dry right away. You run the risk of ruining that very expensive piece of clothing. So again, why is she dressed this way? Well, this is what we saw with Velázquez, is that she's interested in proclaiming the importance of being an artist, that artistic activity is a refined and nearly aristocratic pursuit. It gives her lasting glory. And in fact, we see her painting the kinds of pictures that she was known to have painted. And here we see one of her paintings, these revelers making music together and having fun, but again, taking the time to acknowledge your presence. You get to join them. And in this particular case, over at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, we see Leister in a self-portrait, singing along with these two men who are painting. And you can see that the structure of the face, the overall layout of the lute player on your right, is very similar to the violin player in her self-portrait. These are the kinds of works that she was famous for. We think that her self-portrait was probably painted for the Painters Guild in Haarlem, where as a presentation piece to show her skill, a masterpiece, as she became a master painter. Now, certainly her concert image has the distant influence of Caravaggio, a very similar theme to the sorts of things that Caravaggio was painting and other artists were copying. Leister never ever went to Italy, but at the same time, she's picking up those influences as they filtered their way back to the Low Countries through other artists who had gone and seen Caravaggio pictures.